All right, good morning, and thank you so much for having us today. My name is Lauren Subsede. I'm the Distributed Energy Resources Manager at SDG&E. Today I'm joined by my colleagues in order of presenting. It's Harrison Kim, um, Merdad Yazdani Buki, Devon Youssef, um, Stephen Percia, Jose Cardenas, and Greg Smith. So today we're going to be sharing with you our experience integrating microgrids at SDG&E, a lot of our lessons learned. And so once again, thank you so much for this opportunity to share this with you today. Next slide, please. Today we're going to be going over some of the definitions that we'll be reviewing throughout the presentation, what we do to plan and forecast for a microgrid. We'll give you some real life experiences with operating a microgrid and some of our real world experiences, both for planned compliance work and also for emergencies. So that being said, I'd like to pass it on to our first panelist, Harrison Kim. Harrison, thank you so much for being with us today.
Sorry, I didn't unmute myself. So to start us off, I'll take us through an overview of what a microgrid is and some of the SDG&E projects to lay some groundwork for the later slides. And so yeah, we can go into the next slide. So here we have pretty much a textbook definition of what a microgrid is. It is an independent grid with on-site energy generation or storage that can operate while connected or disconnected from the large utility grid. We call that state of being connected parallel and that state of being disconnected islanded, and you'll hear those terms a lot. The DOE also has their official definition, which is a group of interconnected loads and DERs with clearly defined and isolatable electrical boundaries. I think another way to think of this, if you ever remember some of those old shows where the robots can combine to make a stronger one, but they can still operate and function on their own. This is kind of the same idea. Microgrids are the same way. They can combine to make up the larger power grid while still being self-sufficient. Next slide. I think that shows Power Rangers. So here we have some of the terms that you will likely hear when discussing microgrids, which I will go more into detail as you, yeah. So the first one is the microgrid controller, which is basically the utility's control over resources and assets within the microgrid in front of the meter, or in other words, on the line side. The microgrid controller is what allows the utility's distribution control center to operate the microgrid, as well as coordinate with third-party resources or loads or customers behind the meter. On the other side, we have the site or plant controllers, which control the functions of the generators at a specific site. If you can imagine a site that might have like a battery system, a PV system, maybe some EVs or other resources, the site controller would be the one to operate how each of those work together and their input or output with the grid. At even a lower level, there's the generation controller, which control those specific assets. So each of those individual resources will have their own generation controller to control their operation. And with this, we can enable those resources to schedule their dispatch or assist in things like load curtailment and participate in energy market operations. Another term that you'll see is islanding isolation devices. And this is the point of common coupling between the microgrid itself and the utility grid. This is usually like a circuit breaker, a recloser, or a switch that gives us control to connect or disconnect that microgrid from the utility grid. Another important term is grid forming resource, which is definitely something that you might hear a lot. This is a generation resource, which also serves as a source of voltage or frequency for the microgrid to help with balancing and black start. Essentially what this means is all of the DERs in the microgrid have to be on the same page. And so we accomplish this by assigning one of them to be the leader and having all the other ones follow the leader. Lastly, to mention black start, that basically means that the microgrid can be started up from being from a state of being completely de-energized with help of a generation resource or resources. Next slide, please. Oh, so are there any questions so far? All right, let's continue. Oh.
Hi, Harrison. It's Pat with PUC. On your definitions for microgrid controller, would you say that let's say a really simple single premise facility that meets the definition of microgrid, let's just say small PV and a battery, would you say then that system, although it meets the definition of a microgrid, doesn't have a microgrid controller?
I think generally the microgrid controller, it is utility owned. So if the utility is the one that's operating that, then it would meet that definition. But in your scenario, if there's no utility involved, then I wouldn't say so.
I think Julian, Julian, this is Greg Smith. I think what we're talking about here are community level microgrids that leverage distribution infrastructure. So when something's behind the meter, clearly that facility can have its own microgrid controller, and that may be combined with the site controller that Harrison mentioned. So it may actually be able to self-isolate as well. But we're really focusing our conversation around community level microgrids that leverage distribution infrastructure. That helps clarify things.
Yeah, Greg, I agree. That is where our conversation is centered around. I just wasn't sure how that was applying to making the definition specific to the type of microgrid.
Yeah, no.
Thanks for the clarification.
No worries.
All right, thank you. We can move on to the next slide. So here we have a picture that is a conceptual example of what makes up a microgrid. So you can see there are a lot of different resources like a wind farm, a solar farm. There's a building at the bottom that has its own PV system and battery system, and there's one that is just purely a battery. So traditionally we have primarily had a point A to point B system where in the past we produced most of electricity at large power plants and delivered to end customers. But with microgrids today, we see more of a bidirectional flow between each of the consumers and resources. So there isn't as much of a point A to point B system. As you can kind of see on the lines, there's a bidirectional flow between all of the resources. Just to reiterate some of the terms, there we have the microgrid controller, which is the man who's standing behind the computer screen. And what he's doing is he's operating the devices on the grid to maintain microgrid stability. And there will be automation built into the grid. So as you can see, there's things like the feeder automation system technology. We also have the plant controller, which down below at the facility that says SDG&E on it, which is coordinating between different resources on site. So in this situation, there's a battery system and PV system that are co-located there. But this doesn't necessarily have to be SDG. It can be a third party or any business that has multiple different resources that have to coordinate with each other. There's also the generation controller up top, which is the battery in a building, and that is controlling that single asset. And in this situation, that asset is tied into a dedicated position at the substation. Next slide, please. So now that we kind of gone through the conceptual example, I can take us through one of our premier microgrids. So Borrego Springs microgrid is one of the largest and also happens to be one of the first microgrids in our country. It feeds about 2,800 customers and generally experiences pretty dry and hot weather. It's in a somewhat isolated community in a remote area that's quite far from our control center. And it's fed by a single transmission line, which, all of these conditions I mentioned factor into why we wanted to build a microgrid in this location at the first place. Currently, This site has several battery systems that amount to about 4.5 megawatt hours in capacity with a 1.5 megawatt output. We also have some third-party generation on this microgrid, one being a 26 megawatt solar plant owned and operated by Clearway, and a 6.5 megawatt solar farm operated by Desert Green. There's also about 5 megawatts of rooftop solar from the customers on the grid who, these are considered, those customers are considered passive since we can't control them. One thing to note is that we, the Microgrid Controller for the utility, need to have access to command the output of the large resources on the microgrid. So actually, when we do microgrid, we keep Desert Green disconnected because we actually aren't authorized to control the facility, which we need to be able to do to reliably operate the microgrid. Also,
Harrison, do you mind if I make a comment? I'm sorry.
Sure.
Yeah, I just want to let you know, there's been this discussion about leveraging behind the meter resources in microgrids. And it's clear from this slide, you can see that, behind the meter resources are in fact contributing to the resource at Borrego Springs. And I think what Harrison mentioned is a key point, whether they're actively controlled or are they passive resources. And so the existence of third party or NEM connected solar storage, other resources do in fact provide support and resources to the microgrid, even at this time. It's just an interesting point to take note of, as well as how those resources influence your planning decisions in terms of the capabilities of those generating facilities and what that means to your planning assumptions, which I think we'll get into in more detail later.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. And also, when during the day, we generally have to curtail some of the solar that we get from Clearway because, we just have a lot of solar generation out there. So lastly, some other assets that we have on site is we have two 1.8 megawatt diesel generators and a 0.25 megawatt ultra cap, which both bring diversity and grid stability. Last thing I want to note is that the diesel generators are the grid forming resource that I kind of mentioned earlier that provide that voltage and frequency for the other resources for reference. And so with that, we can have the ability to black start and maintain that stability that we desire. Next slide, please. So just to go into some of the significance and impacts of the Borrego Springs microgrid. Since it was created in 2013, we have been able to enhance the community resiliency as well as demonstrate the coordination between utility and third-party resources within a microgrid. Like I mentioned before, it really is one of the first in its kind and to the scale. And us having the privilege to operate this microgrid has allowed us to better understand the use cases of microgrids as well as design considerations for future ones. In the future, we do plan to explore and research new avenues to improve the Borrego Springs microgrid through things like more advanced protection and controls, resource scheduling, and hopefully one day converting the microgrid to be 100% renewable capable. Next, I'll pass it off to Mehrdad to talk about some of the other ongoing microgrid projects.
All right. Thank you, Mr. I'm going to talk about, next slide, please. Great, thank you. So I'm going to talk about a few of the microgrid projects that we are currently working on at SDG&E. Cameron Corners is pretty much the first 100% renewable microgrid that is using 875 kW PV system along with 540 kW 2.4 megawatt hours energy storage system. So we are going to talk about how we are, efficiently sizing the microgrids to be able to fit the load in the future slides. But continuing with Cameron Corners, based on where the site is actually located in the high-fire trade zone, the iron flow battery technology was used for this site, which makes it a non-combustible and non-toxic energy storage site. So the primary usage of the Cameron Corners microgrid is to provide a backup power during the public safety power shutoff or PSPS events. And this microgrid is basically providing power to 8 critical commercial customers during the grid outage. And also it is planned to participate in the catalyst market during the non-fire season. Next slide, please. So Ramona Air Attack Base is the next microgrid project that we are currently working on, and is roughly 500 kW, 2 MWh energy storage system. And similar to Cameron Corners, is providing backup power resiliency to critical customers during the grid outage. And also it will be participating in the market during non-fire season. So Ramona Airport is a single source of energy storage or microgrid site. And for that reason, it needed to be sized in a way that it can provide power to the critical customers for a longer period of time without being charged from the grid or any of the renewable resources on the grid. Next slide, please. So VRF is basically another project that is going on at the SDG&E, and is named after the type of the technology that is used for this batteries. It's using a vanadium redox chemical solution for the energy storage for the batteries. So this site was commissioned back in 2017, and also it's been participating in the catalyst market since 2019. So VRF is basically capable of running in all the modes of in parallel operations, such as constant real reactive power, peak shaving, load smoothing. However, one of the ongoing efforts with the VRF is to make this site to operate as a microgrid. So I didn't really dive into the structure of the microgrid in the previous slides, but what makes the VRF project to be different from Cameron Corners or Ramona Airport is that the point of common coupling is for VRF is remote, and it's about 2 miles away from where the assets are located, and that brings challenges such as communication latency between devices and power losses, which should be taken into consideration for successful microgrid operation. So with that, I pass it on to Devon.
All right. Hello, my name is Devon. I guess before I start off on planning microgrid, does anyone have any questions so far? I think we're good. All right. Planning a microgrid. Next slide, please. So a lot goes into planning a microgrid and considering its considerations. There's defining microgrid boundaries. That we have a very high level description here, but as we go through these descriptions, we'll break it down further in the next slide. To start off, defining a microgrid boundary. How many customers will be on the microgrid? What will the microgrid entail? Will it include a substation? Will it include a circuit, a segment of a circuit, along with its isolation points? It's very important to match the load with generation to maintain that voltage, frequency, and power factor. These are very important when you're loading your generation or your microgrid in this case. Determining transition times. How long will it restore power in an island, whether it's seamless and the customer would not see an outage per se, and we'd be able to seamlessly transfer to a microgrid and kind of use our renewable resources without customer seeing that impact. And how long will that take? How long will that transition take? And then things like black start, when the customers are in a de-energized state or offline, how long will the procedures or the steps take to bring them back online and to reinsure they are powered up by our microgrid or by a microgrid? So next up is defining loads, understanding the critical demand response, peak loads, determining the island duration. How long will the island last for? Will it last days? Will it last hours? These are very important considerations, which we'll talk about further in the next slide. So, and lastly, is defining the generation needs, whether it's renewables, energy storage, fossil generation with contingencies. There are many options out there, and given the location and where you are, that there is a resource that best suits that location. Next slide, please. So to start off, this is Borrego Springs, as Harrison kind of explained earlier with the generation resources and what we have at Borrego. This is pretty much the topology. I don't expect you to see everything inside there or understand it. The next slide will explain a little bit more, but all these different colors, you'll see teal, purple, these red boxes that point out to sectionalizing devices or SCADA devices. This is basically what entails the Borrego microgrid boundary and just what the whole microgrid entails. Or I guess covers. Next slide, please. So here is basically a one line showing Borrego Springs. This is a SCADA device topology. So everything you see in red and green here, that is some form of a switch or basically a switch that has capabilities of providing real-time data to your microgrid to help us determine during a microgrid what is going on in the island, whether we need to curtail load or things like this. We take great advantage with this information and feed it to our systems to enable us to use it to its full potential. So given all these devices here, it just helps you utilize and create a much more diverse microgrid. Next slide, please. So load estimation, there's many tools that we use to determine load. We can use spot pi or SCADA data. So as the previous slide, we can use that data and look up from sectionalizing devices, or we can use our pi historian, which can give us data from circuit level or much bigger multitudes of customers of data. And we can go down as low as the AMI data, where let's say if a customer has a lot of solar and we need to study it, or there's a 3-phase motor that takes on a lot of power. We need to understand these things to, when we pick up islands, or especially during a black start, which we'll get into, it's very important to understand these and to see how it's going to interact with our microgrid. We also have PMU data, which is very high speed data that we can use in real time or as historical data. And then lastly, we have Synergy Electric. It's a power flow and load flow software. So it can, model your distribution line from substation to end of the line and basically cover all your customers, and you can run load calculations and just basically get a good understanding of what your load looks like for your microgrid. Next slide, please. So DR resources managed by controllers. As you all know, there are many different resources going out there: battery, solar, rooftop solar. Those are, rooftop solar and customer batteries, those are passive grid connected. So they are non-controllable. They kind of do as they want. And we as a utility or as a microgrid operator currently don't have no control over that. So we have to be very cognizant of that kind of resource providing to our microgrid. And we'll get into it later on of kind of the challenges that we may see with that. So next up is active grid connected resources. So these are resources that are within the microgrid controller, ones that we can control within the microgrid controller and put them in specific modes of operations, whether we want them just to output some kW or kVAR, or we want them to operate in a specific mode. We have that versatility to be able to use with the microgrid controller for these, what we call grid following assets. Next and most importantly is your grid forming asset for microgrid. This resource is definitely part of the microgrid controller, and it's the most important resource because this is basically what's establishing your voltage and frequency. Without this component or without this resource in a grid forming state, it's very hard or impossible pretty much to create an island because you don't have that steady voltage frequency kind of source focused on that. And in the graph below, you see a power burst time. So this could be a great example of like a passive grid connected resource. You could see during the morning and the evenings, it's not really doing anything. It's zero kW output. But as you go in through the day, you start seeing a lot of excess generation from a solar. So we can use data like this to help us understand, microgrid loads and capacities and understand and help us dictate, the durations of how long our microgrid can typically last for. So next slide, please. So resource estimation example. So as I've explaining before, with rooftop solar, with different loads out on the circuit, we need to understand, how long we're gonna be keeping a microgrid up for. When we think of a project, we say whether it's 24 hours or 40 hours. In this case, we chose 72 hours. We would like a microgrid to last 72 hours if an event occurs or a PSPS event or any sort of event occurs. So next up would be energy. How long will it take to keep up that duration for? Will you need to incorporate other resources. So this is just an example of 4.8 megawatt hours. This isn't, in terms of battery, how much capacity the battery can store. This basically helps you create your generator portfolio mix and allows you to determine how much solar, how much battery. During the day, we're going to need the solar to cover our load and to be able to charge the batteries overnight if we plan on doing something for 72 hours, or oversize the battery, whichever one makes more sense in the scenario you're dealing with. And on the right kind of shows you the portfolio mix in a little computer there. Kind of solar, storage, and customer-owned generation. We take all these things into consideration. Another thing to take into consideration is black start requirements. As I was mentioning before with three-phase motor loads, when you turn on equipment from an offline state, so when we're going from a black start to turning on all these customers, it's not like a steady state where, you have constant current, running these equipments. These things will, multiply 1.5, 2 times, sometimes 3 times its original current initially when turning it on. So we need to take these into consideration and make sure our resources can withstand that kind of initial load pickup. Another thing is peak power and balancing requirements, load management to increase time to live, whether, the isolation devices that we showed before, we can turn one off or open it up to enable ourselves to allow the island to last longer. So minimize the amount of load on the resource. And there's some contingencies we need to take into consideration as well, such as, generation resource intermittency. For example, batteries. There are many inverters in batteries, depending on how you size it, set it up. Many strings are connected to one, or many containers could be connected to one inverter, or you can have one container connect to one inverter directly. It's all up to you. It all comes with expenses, but it also comes with contingencies. If you lose one container versus losing one inverter, will that tear down your microgrid, or will you still be able to hold up and have enough space to cover your microgrid? And also future load growth. People are moving. There's all, EVs coming into the picture, or it has been coming into the picture. So there's always constant EV growth or load growth. So we need to take that into consideration when we're bringing in these resources. Next slide, please. Oh, Stephen wanted to say something. From here, can you hear?
Yeah, I wanted to bring something else up on the last slide that I think is important to mention. So when we look at that portfolio mix, it's important to really understand what your customer loads are that you have out there that are in your microgrid. So certain systems or areas across their service territory, there's more commercial customers versus residential customers. So you might have more load during the day than in the evening, or vice versa. So like in this particular example, in this particular example, you have a lot more solar here, and that could be this might have heavy, commercialization in this area, and solar is the proper generation resource to cover that solar, as well as charge your battery up to ride through the evening. Additionally, there's other considerations that need to be taken into account, such as the location of the solar. Is there anything such as trees or mountain range, something like that, that can impede the generation from that solar? So all those things really need to be looked at when designing microgrid.
Thanks, Stephen. I appreciate that. So can we move on to the next slide, and then after this we'll stop for some questions. So we actually have an integrated test facility here, which is it's a RTDS modeling system. Basically, it's a hardware in the loop, real-time digital simulator. So this super smart computer, you can call it, basically simulates the grid, and we can, if you look on the pictures on the right, these are all devices and components that you would maybe typically see on the field, and we would run simulations with the grid and reinsure, all the logic, all the things, all the modes of operations, or all the different sequences of events we run. We can basically run a full-on model through the simulation to ensure when we transfer this resource and bring it onto the grid and turn it on for the first time, and run all these tests, that we can ensure ourselves and feel more comfortable that these resources will operate accordingly to how we modeled them. So it's a very technical, amazing, personal thing that it's just a great tool to use to simulate the grid and to to stimulate your load and generation, and any inverter or resource that you put into it, it can all be modeled as one. So with that being said, I will stop there and see if anyone has any questions before we move on to the next topic. No questions? All right. So now I'll be passing it on to Stephen, who will be talking about. Hello? About operating a microgrid. Thank you.
All right, next slide, please. All right, so there's 3 different ways to enter into a microgrid from being grid connected. The first one is really through a planned operation. And for us, that's typically either a planned event. If we know a PSPS is coming, that's typically planned a few days ahead of time. So we'll coordinate with our control center. We'll put together a switch plan, and we'll work with them when we go to establish this microgrid. There could be other reasons for planned islanding, such as work taking place on the electrical system. So work at our substations, work on the transmission lines, pretty much anything. Whenever something needs to be de-energized, we can consider that planned islanding. And typically when it's a planned island, the customers are seamlessly transferred, meaning they don't see a blip, they don't see anything when they go from being connected to the electric system to being in an island. The next type of island that we have is an emergency island. And typically this isn't planned. This is some sort of emergency event that has taken place. It could be damage to a pole, could be something else that's happened. But ultimately we have a pre-existing switch plan that we hold at our operations center. And ultimately we go through steps there and we seamlessly transfer the load from the electric system to the microgrid, allowing those customers to remain energized while work is performed to fix whatever that issue was. The last way we enter an island is some sort of event took place and the electric system is de-energized. So this is a black start scenario. Ultimately, in this particular scenario, we do have a switch plan that is set up just to kind of get our resources online. But from there, we work with our operations center to slowly pick up the load. And it's important to slowly pick up the load because especially in a case like Borrego, when you have almost 3,000 customers that you're picking up, you can't do it all at once. And I think Devon actually mentioned that earlier when he was talking about cold load pickup or inrush. So as he mentioned, there are times where when you pick up load, you can see up to 3 times the amount of load that you saw prior to the outage. So what we do is we work with our control center. We looked at what took place prior. And then from there, we start closing in load little by little. Next, we have load shedding. So it's important to really understand how much time you have to live, as we call it. So ultimately, sorry, I got thrown off there for a second. So ultimately, the time to live, it really looks at all the resources in the microgrid. It looks at fuel in the generators, looks at energy in the batteries, all those sorts of things. And it comes up with a plan for how to ultimately estimate how much time your grid has to live. Now, if you have an event you plan for maybe a couple hours, but we get some new information and now it needs to last a day, you have to make some changes in terms of how you're going to meet those new conditions. So we can open field ties, distribution switches, and shed load in that particular circumstance there, and that will allow us to extend the duration. Additionally, if there's something that takes place that takes a generation resource offline in the middle of a microgrid, again, we might have to shed load just to keep the other customers online. Lastly, once we're finished with an island, the grid is back, we need to resynchronize the microgrid back with the grid. And this is actually a 2-step process. So ultimately, the grid forming device, Harrison mentioned the generators is currently our grid forming device in Borrego. And we are looking through some new efforts that we're doing to actually convert that to a battery, most likely. But ultimately, that begins to synchronize with the grid. And once it's synchronized with the grid, it then talks to our protection relays, and our protection relays do a second check. So once they double check to make sure that it truly is synchronized, Once that's been performed, then the breaker or recloser or whatever it happened to be will then close. All right, so next I'm going to pass it to Jose, who's going to talk about the microgrid controller. So next slide.
Thank you, Stephen.
Excuse me,
Stephen,
Jose.
actually, if we could just pause for a second, I think we have a few questions in the chat box that maybe we can address verbally.
Sure.
Were you going to do that, Greg?
I can start. You know, the first question was around Borrego, that I see around Borrego microgrid. Is there a need to curtail the distributed generation, NEM generation? If so, how is this accomplished? No. Again, as we mentioned up front, NEM is a passive microgrid resource. Any behind the meter NEM resource is going to behave according to its, you know, pre-programmed behavior. We do see some issues in terms of old style inverters, you know, not having great ride through capabilities, and they all can reconnect at once. So depending on this goes back, as we mentioned earlier, in terms of the planning assumptions. And but no, nothing happens to NEM resources. They just behave as possible. Then I see one around the gas-fired generation or cogen systems. There's nothing that permits or would inhibit generation systems from operating as long as they are incorporated into the model and we have an agreement with them. It really becomes more of a policy issue in terms of, you know, how you want to use fossil fueled resources in terms of the microgrid and what the policies are. So there's no real technical issue in terms of being able to incorporate those resources. I mean, certainly there's lots of details and work to be done, but nothing technically precludes their use. It becomes, you know, both a combination of policy and just studies. So those are the two that I see.
Greg, just to be clear, you're talking about behind the meter, not on the grid during an on operation, correct?
It's the actual gas-fired cogen systems to serve as the black start. So that would require lots of, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't actually see the black start process. That would require, again, much more involved studies in terms of delegating that service to a third-party resource.
Yeah, and we'd, you know, there'd be a lot of involvement with our microgrid controller, right? So that's a lot more.
Absolutely.
So,
absolutely.
Yeah,
so I mean, no, there's technical capabilities, but how we would leverage that requires lots of detailed design discussion for sure.
Do we have another question, or does that wrap up the questions for now?
There is actually one question up there that I don't, can someone, I don't know who read it in terms of 100%, is Synergy Electric Load Flow software capable of running load flow in islanded form from 100% IBR microgrid? I'm not sure I understand IBR in this point. So the person that made that comment, the acronym IBR.
Yeah, we don't know what that is either here, Greg.
So that would be, so someone can.
Alex Mora, if you want to, we can unmute you if you'd like to ask that question.
Sure, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes, we can. Yeah, inverter-based generation. So IBR is inverter-based resources.
Did you say inverter?
Yes.
Oh, in that case, yes, that is definitely possible. And that, in fact, when you were looking at some of the activities at Cameron Corners, that's 100% renewable battery plus solar. So that's definitely a capability.
Yeah, that's why I was asking the question.
Oh, okay.
So just to clarify, the question was, do we model like inverter-based technology outside of our microgrid, like behind the meter, with our microgrid?
I assume you mean in a planning mode, in terms of our planning. Is that the question? As we plan microgrids?
Yeah, so I guess what I'm trying to find out is if you had a project where you had all inverter-based resources, could you then run a load flow in an islanded state with your utility source disconnected? Is that a possibility?
Hey, Alex, it's Stephen Percia here. I can answer this question. So ultimately, Synergy Electric, for those of you that aren't familiar with the software, it's a load flow software. It allows us to see system constraints and everything like that. Ultimately, we can put in various new generation resources and run a study. So if we had a big, solar plant or battery, something like that, some renewable or inverter-based technology, we could drop that into that load flow software and see how it would impact the system. Ultimately, we like to take it one step further. I know we talked earlier about RTDS. RTDS definitely gives us a little more visibility than Synergy Electric, but we use Synergy Electric as just like an initial planning tool. Does that answer your question?
Thanks, Gary.
And just to add to that, we can, if we have a model of that inverter, if we feel the need, we can run that through the RTDS model and see how it's going to behave in that circuit we're planning to island, because we model our circuits for where we plan to put our microgrids. So the more modeling we do and testing we do in the lab makes us more successful in the field. I hope that answers that question. Okay, I think we have 11 minutes left, so to respect everyone's time, I think we'll get going here. So here you have a snapshot of our microgrid controller. You have on the top left here, you can set your voltage and frequency at the top left. On the bottom, you'll have all your assets that are participating in your microgrid group. Also, here's where you can distinguish what assets can be your island master. The island master is what's going to be controlling the voltage and frequency during your island events. Here in the middle, you can see where it says current load. That's your estimated current for your microgrid. And then below that's kind of hard to see. That's your time to live. So it gives you, based on your current load, your resource state of charge, let's say your battery state of charge and your generators, the fuel level, based on the load, it'll give you a time to live. On the top right here, you see the grid, inverted triangle here. That represents your grid. You have your voltage and frequency. On the very bottom, you'll see your voltage frequency of your island. In this particular snapshot was taken when we were islanded, so you can see the status of the breaker being green, opened, which means we were islanded. If we were grid connected, you'd see some power flow going across that point of common coupling here, the POC, and that breaker would be red. Now, we talked about seamless transitions and kind of go a little bit more into detail on that. Set an example here. We had 2 megawatts of power flow being imported from the grid. Our resources in the microgrid would start to export to bring that output, to bring the input of those 2 megawatts down below 100 kW, where then our microgrid can now seamlessly transition and pick up the load in the community. Now, the benefits to this is, as Greg and Devon had mentioned, we do leverage some of that passive rooftop solar in Borrego Springs. So being able to do a seamless transition allows us to keep all that solar intact and be part of our microgrid. Let's see, can we go over to the next slide, please? Okay. So here's our protection controls. There's a lot of communication that's happening between here. I'd like to talk to you a little bit about our islands that we have for Borrego. We have island 1, which is we just island this first circuit here at the very bottom here through that 5-way trailer switch. We have island 2, where we can island all 3 circuits via this trailer switch going from our microgrid from way 3 back to the 12 kV bus. Our point of our common coupling from here is going to be transformer number 2, and the point of common coupling for island 1 to be across the 12 kV bus first breaker there. We can see with the big V right there. So that's for island 2. Island 3 is when we incorporate the 12 kV bus. We have that energy solar plant, 69 kV solar plant, and then the point of common coupling for that is across the tie line breaker. So we have multiple points common coupling. We have a 3530, which is like a computer that talks to all these field devices, giving you breaker status, power flow status. It sends all this information back to our microgrid, so we know exactly, what point on common coupling we're looking at, what power flow is going through there, and what we need is zero flow to be able to successfully transition to an island. Also, as Stephen had mentioned, and Devon did for the sync, We're also getting, voltage magnitude and angle from that point of common couplings fed back to our resources in the microgrid to sync up the voltage and angle for the grid. And then, like they mentioned, the microgrid will verify it's synced, and then inside the substation, there's another sync that verifies that we are truly synced, and then sends the breaker command to close. Next slide here, please. So one thing I almost forgot to mention there is, as part of our protection, there are multiple protection groups that we have. So we have a protection group when you're grid connected, to protect the system. When you're grid connected, you have high inertia, you have a lot of fault current available for the relays. When in a microgrid situation, you don't have that. You're in a low inertia system. So we have multiple relay protection settings that automatically switch groups when we're going into an island. So in this slide here, we have the switch in real-time topology. So we, like Devon had mentioned, we have a lot of communication networks going on here. Like we have our SCADA communication going on here. We have all our breaker statuses being fed back to the substation and to our microgrid. Excuse me. We also have phaser measurement unit data, PMU data, being fed back to us as well, giving us the power flow across any one of those switches in the field. And this is being sampled like at 30 samples per second. So this is a high rate of communication going out from field devices to substation devices to a microgrid. So it requires a reliable, fast communication network. We've had to add a microwave power link to add that fast communications and reliability to our system. So there's a lot going on in the background here. So just kind of wanted to highlight all the different communications and the speed it's happening and that allows us to be successful with these operations. Another thing I wanted to talk to you a little bit was that black start that we talked about earlier. In a black start situation, all these breakers, you see red down here will all be green, and we'll be doing load steps. The microgrid will create the voltage and frequency, and then it'll start doing its restoration steps. So like we talked about, that cold load pickup, you first energize that first section of the line, you're going to pick up, the inrush from energizing the line, all the air conditioning, refrigerators, all those loads are going to hit the system at once, and then it's going to, then it'll tailor off and get to a steady state condition, right? So one thing we leverage here is the solar, right? We wait 5 minutes for solar to kick in to kind of increase how much load we can pick up during these island events. So with that being said, when we do the next load step, we have to make sure we can pick up that whole load step. As Devon said, it could be 2 to 3 times the steady state value for your inrush. We have to make sure we can maintain the frequency. Because say we go 2 to 3 load steps into this process and your frequency goes out of balance, you're going to lose all the solar that you had previously picked up that you were depending on during that operation. So it's important that you have section line devices in the field to make sure you are successful when you do that load step. If you have too much load between your isolating devices, you could easily drop the load, frequency could go out of bounds, and then you can drop the whole island. So that's an important consideration you have to take. Make sure you have the appropriate isolating devices in the field to sectionalize your load to make sure you're successful. Okay, I think we'll go on to the next slide, please. So here we have our screenshot of our island transition. To the left, you have grid connected steady state. The bottom, you have your frequency, then you have your current, then you have your voltage at the top. I'm going to focus here on the frequency, where this is super zoomed in. So you'll see pre-island, your grid connected, the frequency is really steady. You have the whole WEC, right, stabilizing the frequency. And as soon as you go into this island transition, you're going to see the voltage oscillate back and forth, right? This is a characteristics of our generators. So they have an envelope that they operate between. Whenever, I'm sorry, frequency. Sorry about that. So yeah, our frequency, it's a frequency envelope. So pretty much when the frequency starts going up, the drain's gonna ramp down to bring the frequency back down. And then once it gets to the bottom end of the envelope, it's gonna ramp up to bring the frequency back in within those bounds. So you'll see this oscillation back and forth of the frequency when you're when you're in your island. Another useful tool for another useful use for this single wave data, this PMU data, is that whenever we are unsuccessful, this also brings in breaker status, what the system trip on 51, all your protection elements come in. We can develop a timeline to see what was the target that caused the ripple to lose your microgrid. So everything is timestamped, GPS timestamped, so we can take a deep dive into this, do an analysis, and determine what was the issue, and help us develop our operating procedures to be successful. So over the years, over doing this over and over again, we've kind of mastered, kind of what to do, what not to do, and gotten us where we are today with our operating procedures. And then on that note, I think I'll be passing over to Lawrence to discuss the real world experiences. Thank you very much. Any questions before we move on? Okay.
I don't think there's any Q&A and no raised hands.
And so next slide, please. Today now I'll be going over some of our real world experience that we've experienced with our microgrid, and obviously our lessons learned. So on average, we average about 2 to 3 operations of the microgrid per year, typically to support compliance maintenance of both the transmission system and distribution system. And we have responded to 2 emergency events since 2013. The most significant one is the one that we have pictured here. This occurred on September 4, 2013. As the team mentioned, the climate in Borrego Springs is typically warm and dry. And usually our summer here begins around late April, where we start encountering about triple-digit weather temperatures, and typically very dry. And then around late August through mid-September, we have our monsoonal summer, where we still experience triple-digit weather conditions, in addition to high precipitation and weather like that. In this case, on September 4, 2013, this is a weather event that brought a microburst to Borrego Springs. It resulted in 11 distribution poles down and 9 transmission poles down. As Harrison mentioned earlier, Virgo Springs is approximately 93 miles from central San Diego. There is only one transmission line that feeds into Borrego Springs. So if any point that transmission line is severed, there is no power to all 2,800 customers in Borrego Springs. And most of the community in Borrego Springs, while progressive, they are a much more mature community. So healthcare and health facilities are limited unless you're able to leave Borrego Springs and seek that type of attention. In this case, on September 4, temperatures were still above 110. This resulted in a flash flood condition. Access and egress into Borrego Springs was very limited. We were able to conduct our patrol safely, able to isolate all of the damage. And within a few hours, I think it was about 4.5 hours, we were able to restore about 1,056 customers in Borrego Springs. Most of those customers were critical facilities and cool zones. So customers in Borrego Springs were able to seek shelter, get air conditioning at a library, stay out of the heat for a little bit. They're able to pick up supplies and also get fuel and propane as needed, just to last the entire 25 hours while restoration efforts were completed in Borrego Springs. One key note here that we like to talk about is, we talk about the 200 field employees that were in the field to make repairs. Of those 200 employees, about 10% of that was comprised of personnel that operated the microgrid, both remotely from the control center, operating any available SCADA device that we had. There were also field personnel providing the isolation to the microgrid. And then there was an individual team member in every single asset to control this microgrid. This was in the early stages of the microgrid, where an advanced microgrid controller did not exist. And luckily, with the experience in the team, they were able to balance the resources and provide that safe electricity and energy to the customers of Borrego Springs. Now, with those lessons learned from being able to operate the microgrid manually, we're able to incorporate that as part of our requirements for our advanced microgrid controller that we have today. Next slide, please. And when we're in a blue sky condition and the microgrid is not required in an island format, we have other purposes for the microgrid. to provide grid support. We do test these assets as part of commissioning. They do undergo a 4-quadrant test, so they can provide that volt-var support when they're not needed in an island. And also wholesale marketplace participation, both for energy ancillary services. We have experience with deferral projects where a microgrid was placed alongside or by a customer premise to support excessive load growth that electric infrastructure could not be placed in time to meet the customer's needs. And we've had deployed energy storage assets to meet those deferral purposes. Next slide, please. So to bring this all together, sorry we're going over here a little bit, but I'll try to envelop this very, very quickly. Oh, okay, thank you. Some of the lessons learned that we've captured in the last 10 years, we've been fortunate to manage tenure within our group very well, and we actually have experienced team members who have been with us for over 11 years. But obviously this is an emerging technology, and although vendors and suppliers may say they can fulfill certain operational capabilities, they still have to be tested appropriately and tested safely. There will be likely points of failure, but how do we manage that? For instance, in Borrego Springs, in a low inertia environment, whether or not we are in an island, there's a high degree of PV penetration, and we have to manage that accordingly and be able to respond to transients in a timely manner. There still is standards and specifications that are being developed. And we have to find ways to institutionalize all of those learnings to support not just pointless development for integration of these resources, but obviously the safe testing and operation of these technologies. Obviously, integrating these various technologies, including renewables, it is complex. We've learned through modeling and through experience that there is a lot of value in putting time forth in a real-time digital simulator to not just test what the technology is capable of doing, test what renewable intermittency does as far as managing stability, but also it plays a key role in post-mortem analysis. We can take these events, place them into our model, and then ultimately test what the behavior of the system is. And then from that, we can create our operating procedures and ensure that all of our standard practices are in place so that these events don't happen again. There's always going to be a need to stack benefits to increase utilization and optimization of all of these energy storage or all these other types of technologies that we're deploying. And with that requires, coordination through several groups. And in our company, that could involve, distribution planning, transmission planning. It could involve customer generation, system protection, electric fuel and procurement, et cetera. But there's a lot of coordination that's required in order to ensure that these assets not only perform well in an island when they're providing that resiliency for the specific customers, but also that they perform well when they're in parallel with electric grid and they can provide those services, not just to a small community, but through the entire electric grid. And ultimately, obviously, we are connected to the electric grid, so physical security and cybersecurity are areas that we are continuing our development in. And those are areas that are very, very important towards future communication protocols. And then obviously, it plays a big role in how we develop our points list and all of our physical standards for deploying new microgrids. Any questions?
Just to check, are there any written questions? Because I do not see any raised hands at this moment.
Okay, so let me scroll down.
I don't see any Q&A right now.
I think there's a next slide to this. Okay, so future enhancements in Virgo Springs. We're currently in our first year of our Department of Energy award, where we're actually shifting our island master or our voltage and frequency grid forming device from the conventional generation to our inverter-based resources. This is a project that will take us through 2023. We put a lot of focus in modeling for this project because obviously we're going to create more of a a low inertia environment for our microgrid. So it was very important that we partner with NREL, the National Renewable Energy Laboratory in Golden, Colorado, and leverage their power hardware and loop experience. Our team is pretty fluent with control hardware and loop. However, power hardware and loop does demand specific expertise with regards to reactive power and managing fine-tuning inverters and modeling equipment to ensure that we can get the most realistic model possible. We will start deploying new equipment later this year and commissioning later this year into early next year. And these new inverter-based inverters, will allow us to create that grid forming asset within the energy storage systems. As part of these projects, obviously the goal here is to reduce our dependency on conventional generation. We do have new projects that will involve installation of a new fuel cell and also a larger energy storage system in Borrego Springs to allow us to not only enhance our life to live, but also allow us to absorb a lot of the excess PV in Borrego Springs and provide that power when during peak times when the sun isn't available. And I believe that's our last slide.
Great, thanks. So now we're going to go ahead and move to a Q&A discussion. Just as a reminder to folks, here you can access the instructions for raising your hands or adding a question to the Q&A panel. And just a reminder to folks, if you raise your hand to ask a question verbally, please at the beginning of your question state both your name and organization for taking notes. I'm going to be stopping the recording for now, and we'll move into this Q&A section.
Upper right-hand corner of your screen, and go ahead, Tim.
Great, thank you. And logistically, do I move slides or do you?
Roseanne's going to move the slides for you.
Okay, great. Yeah, so I'm talking about interconnection hurdles for community microgrids and offer some solutions here. And want to kind of stress this is an early stage discussion. Obviously, this is not a fully fleshed out proposal. I'm going to give some background, then talk about some possible ideas towards solutions. Next slide. So overview here, background on relevant front of meter DER program procurement and interconnection issues. And I should have said exporting rather than front of meter, because this definitely includes larger behind the meter also. And the issues are similar for larger behind the meter as front of meter DER. We'll look at some data, focusing on SCE because that's the best data platform right now from their queue. And then look at some potential solutions, including looking at what form is best, potential automation and streamlining, and then potentially creating a new rule 21.1 for microgrid interconnection. Next slide. Just a reminder, of course, that what we're doing here in this OIR is looking at ways to commercialize microgrids. And so we're looking at community microgrids primarily in this working group. Next slide. So this is some review. I presented about a month and a half ago on some data from our report back in 2019, we call a Modern Cinderella Story, looking at the history of DER programs on the procurement side. But procurement and interconnection are very intertwined, and it's hard to know which is the main hurdle in any particular program. We conclude in that report, looking at the procurement side primarily, that is a big missed opportunity with DER in that looking at the three sectors of utility scale, renewables, and then rooftop, and then in the middle, this front of meter DER segment, only 10% or less has been in this segment. And with all the state's goals for DER and resiliency, this is a big missed opportunity. And of course, partly why we're here today is to look at how to improve that. And moving ahead, microgrids will face the same challenges as front of meter DER and larger BTM DER, but then some additional challenges unique to microgrids, making it even harder in terms of things like the microgrid island study, et cetera. Next slide. So just very quickly on this one, I showed a slide before. This looks at 7 programs over the last decade in California for DER procurement. And we conclude that about 24% of the approved megawatts were installed in that time period. These numbers have changed a little bit since the report came out, but not a whole lot. So the general conclusion is the same here. So I think most of us would agree that 24% of approved megawatts is definitely less than desired if we are in fact prioritizing DER. So next slide. Again, we looked at this last time, so very briefly here today. The record for equity-focused DER is even worse, and that as of about a month ago, as far as we're aware, there's been about 2 megawatts procured and online from equity-focused DER programs, including the DAC GT Solar and the SV43 Renewables EJ carve-out. And so, certainly a big focus of community-scale microgrids and the MIP, which is coming up, is equity. And so in terms of really making sure these programs work as desired, looking at prior programs and trying to figure out why they haven't been working is really key part of looking at potential solutions here. Next slide. So looking more specifically at interconnection issues. There's a little data here we crunched from SCEs and PG&E's interconnection queues. And we focus on SCE, as I mentioned, because they actually have the date for the GIA execution in their spreadsheet, and PG&E does not. So it doesn't actually allow us to extract the full length of interconnection from the queue. But I think to kind of show the scale of issues, I think is sufficient for today. And we're not trying to pick on SCE at all. We're just kind of trying to show an illustrative, data set here of what we have been identifying for some time now as kind of the broad set of issues. So we're looking at just Rule 21 for these data. And looking at SCE, we've had from 2008 to the present about 526 exporting fast track applications. And fast track is meant to be an easier interconnection process where you go through 2 sets of screens rather than detailed study to get to a GIA. And GIA is a generator interconnection agreement, and that's the agreement you have to basically have authority to interconnect to the grid to be operable. In that same time frame for SCE, 51 of those applications made it through to an executed GIA. So that's about 10%. And the average size of projects is 1.4 megawatts. Again, this is just Rule 21. And so we'd expect most projects to go through WDAT or WDT for larger projects. So that makes sense here. And the average time in that time frame for an executed GIA is 391 calendar days, so a bit longer than a year. And also, if we look at the last 5 years as a more relevant subset for today's situation, it was about 354 calendar days to get to a GIA, so about a year. And so certainly we see a lot of room for improvement there. Because for GPI, a fast track should take less than a year to get to an executed GIA. For PG&E, there's been quite a few more applications, 1,300 in that same time frame. About 70 got through to an executed GIA, so that's about 5%. And average size 1 megawatt. Next slide.
Tam, this is Pat. Before we move to the next slide, how many of those roughly 1,800 projects are large NEM and how many are QFs?
I don't know because the spreadsheet doesn't distinguish those readily. They're exporting Rule 21. And so unless I'm wrong on that, maybe SC or PG&E can speak up. But as far as I can tell from the spreadsheet, they don't readily distinguish large NEM from front of meter wholesale. It's basically all exporting Rule 21 under fast track.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, if someone from the utilities knows an answer to that question and wants to paste it in the Q&A or chime in at the end, that would be great. Thanks.
No problem. Next slide. So here's data from the SCEQ, again, going back to 2008. And the top shows the whole array, and this is 68 projects over that time frame that fit the criteria, again, exporting Rule 21 fast track. And you can see there's a nice declining trend line here showing things have gotten faster over time. So definitely some improvements. The bottom shows the last 5 years. since 2016, and this is 28 projects. And again, a nice declining trend line. So we are seeing some improvements. I want to highlight, though, that the last 2 years have seen only 6 projects in this category, and they're under 0.5 megawatt each. And so I think probably a big part of why we're seeing lower duration to get to a GIA execution in this case is because they're smaller projects under 0.5 megawatt. Typically, you're going to see longer timelines for the larger projects. Next slide. Or any questions, feel free to, to bust in with questions. So looking to potential solutions. We're kind of posing some questions here for stakeholders in the commission, and then we'll offer, like I said, some preliminary answers of our own, meant to kind of spur discussion here today and moving forward. So we're looking at, what is the appropriate venue for Rule 21 reform, and or WDT, WDAT reform. And we were happy to see in a recent proposal from the commission, the suggestion that the commission staff will become active in WDAT reform at FERC. So rather than simply focusing on Rule 21 and hoping that the FERC process mirrors Rule 21 changes, the commission has said they plan to be proactive and get involved in that. So that's a great step forward. Second, we'll look at automation, and this has been promising in many ways, but it's been a slow rollout, and we think a lot more could be done in the near term. And then third, we'll look at should there be a separate interconnection tariff, new Rule 21.1 for community microgrids. Next slide. Next slide. So this is, a genuine question. We don't have the answer here. We see maybe 3 different proceedings that could be the venue for reform. And the obvious one is this proceeding. It's been queued up in this RMWG. It's not being queued up in the main proceeding yet in terms of significant interconnection reform for microgrids, but it certainly could be. So this is, definitely a natural home, I think, for this. The default, though, historically has been to put these kind of issues into the Rule 21 focus proceeding, which is currently R170707. And the issue we see there is that Rule 21 proceeding right now has been, it's got a lot of issues on its plate. And so it's taking a number of years to resolve the existing issues. And so we're looking right now at a phase 2, and that's going to be probably a couple years. I don't see these microgrid specific interconnection issues being queued up and resolved in that proceeding for probably 3 to 5 years. I don't think that's ideal given the issues we're looking at resolving in the near term. Another possibility would be emergency reliability, R201103. That definitely could make sense also because that is focused on near-term procurement. And I think almost everyone recognizes that to get near-term procurement, if we're looking at generation, we do need to look also at interconnection issues and potential solutions. And then possibly a new proceeding. So just some ideas throwing out there. I don't have the solutions. Next slide. Next. Now, GPI worked with the Clean Coalition a few years ago in 2018 in the Rule 21 Working Group 2. And there were, I guess, 4 working groups over a number of years in the current proceeding looking at specific issues. And we put together a fairly detailed report looking at potential automation and streamlining improvements. And it's attached as the issue 8 appendix to the Working Group 2 final report. This is an image from that report, just showing fairly roughly the timelines at issue for the main steps in the fast track process. And the light green are estimated in some cases, so these are not meant to be exact. And they're also changing over time. And so, when you look at the chart, there are 2, large ones that stand out, and it's the completeness review for potential improvements, and then the GIA offer and negotiation process currently, allows 90 calendar days. It goes over sometimes. We'll talk in a second about ways to, shorten the overall process. Next slide. So I'm going to go through briefly the recommendations from our report. This is text from 2018, so forgive anything that's not up to date, because again, it's 3 years old. So not everything is meant to be up to date. We just simply duplicate the text here for discussion purposes. So these are the top recommendations from our report, which we think are still relevant for today in terms of potential improvements. So there has been work done on automating the application process. The utilities do have new interconnection portals that they don't automate per se the process, but they make the process quicker and in many cases smoother, because it's a matter of populating the right boxes. And hopefully the utilities can speak up today about their experience with, faster processing times. Our experience, both in my role with GPI as a policy attorney, and also in my role as a consulting attorney for developers, is that it's quite a few kickbacks and iterations in terms of submitting applications, being told you need to fix this, sending it back, waiting another 10 days, getting another notice that needs to be revised. So that could take, a fair amount of time. If we automate that process where the turnaround time is shortened on both sides dramatically, it could be reduced from what can be, easily a month or more to hopefully a few days or less. And then the application process, we're combining with the completeness review, which is that back and forth process I just mentioned. And so we're making steps on this in the right direction, but it's definitely not gotten to the point where that process is automated. And we don't yet have data showing, as far as I know, that that process has become shortened before, since before the application portals came out. Next slide. Automating at least partially initial review is definitely an area we think could be improved. Currently, that process takes 15 business days. And there has been a lot of work, obviously, on the ICA, which does not include initial review screens. The ICA process is mainly related to the supplemental review screens. And there's been definitely a lot of debate, and there was in 2018 and 2019, about the feasibility of automating the initial review screens. We identify in the report ways we think, in discussions with various folks, including engineers, that those screens could be automated, or at least mostly automated. So we'd love to revisit that conversation here. It's more urgent, of course, for various reasons, and we hope that the technology has improved in that 3-year time period to allow for more productive, paths forward. Then similarly, automating at least partially supplemental review. I just mentioned that these screens were mostly automated with the ICA, and that leaves only the screen P, a catch-all safety and reliability screen, which probably requires some human review moving forward for some time, just to make sure that you don't have errors cropping up. And when we talk about automation, GPI is never intended for this to be, a sudden process. We recognize you need to have human review along the steps toward full automation to make sure things actually work. So we really want to see, incremental steps along the way. But I think the urgency of today's, issues suggests a little faster pace than has been done historically. Next slide. And then front-loading supplemental review screens N&O into initial review could make the process faster, because N&O are already mostly automated through the ICA. And if you go through initial review to get your site-specific answer about interconnection capacity, because the ICA is not meant to be definitive, you still have to go through the process of the screening various screens in IR and SR. If you can, in fact, front-load N&O into IR, that could, in theory, avoid SR, and that can definitely cut off a couple months in the interconnection process. Next one is combining the IR and SR, and this actually was done in D20-09035, and is in the final stages of implementation with advice letter resolutions coming out hopefully fairly soon. And the point here of this improvement is that there's often a few weeks between IR and SR for a scoping meeting, in terms of scheduling the meeting, in terms of holding the meeting. in terms of pulling the trigger on the SR, in terms of getting the money in for the SR. So this improvement will allow applicants to combine that process up front when they know they're going to fail IR, and any exporting project will fail IR. And so rather than going through the motions of having a scope meeting, et cetera, just skip that, go straight through to the SR, and you'll save a month or possibly more. And last, front-loading and automating the GIA. We suggested that this could be generated early on once the application is deemed complete, and it can proceed concurrently with the screening process rather than waiting to get to the end of the screening process, then getting the GIA and then having another 90 days of negotiation, et cetera. If you can do it concurrently, you could, in theory, reduce the whole process by 90 days or even more. Next slide. Next slide. So looking at PG&E's CMET, we suggest it's best characterized as a supplemental interconnection tariff for microgrids because it primarily describes the microgrid islanding study, and it also describes the possibility of reimbursement for islanding equipment. In terms of a new tariff, we're suggesting that because of the issues that are specific to microgrids for interconnection, a new tariff, Rule 21.1, could be created that would give applicants an option to study all components jointly in a single application. It would include the islanding study, and it would include timelines to the same or better granularity than the current Rule 21 for each step in the process. And it would apply to all IOUs, including PG&E. And so our hope with this suggestion is that it would lead to, in the next year or two, or even sooner, hopefully, a fleshed out tariff that describes how community microgrids can actually connect to the grid and gives some certainty regarding timelines. And this is an urgent issue because of the MIP in particular. The MIP is coming down fairly soon. And currently, the timeline for completing the MIP will be 24 months from contract award. Without some timelines in an interconnection process, that time could easily be chewed up with interconnection alone. And so in order to have some certainty about investments in those projects, we definitely need to have some timelines for interconnection. And then beyond the MIP, just having community microgrids be an option more generally definitely weighs heavily in favor of a more microgrid specific interconnection process that's transparent and includes timelines. So that's it. So any questions, please ask.
Thanks, Tam. I did want to point out so that everyone knows where the scope of the microgrids proceeding is, that the commission does have a decision adopting recommendations related to Rule 21 working groups 2, working group 3, and the vehicle to grid alternating current subgroup. And that decision's from September 2020. It's D2009035. And so issues that have been, that are subject of an existing commission decision are not going to be in scope of this proceeding. So it'll have to be something that is microgrid specific and that has not been considered by the commission in a prior decision. So I'm going to turn off recording now.
Let's clarify the point, Patrick.
Go ahead.
Just to be clear, our intention, the recommendations today are meant to be microgrid specific, where they haven't been adopted already by the commission. And so given the commission's focus and the statewide policy focus and urgency on microgrids and other possible DER solutions to PSPS events, et cetera, it would seem those would be in scope, but we'll see.
Okay, thanks for the clarification, Tim. I am going to turn off recording now.